my question is, are these global goal settings and global summits meaningful? Do they elicit change? Do they elicit action? Do these summits matter for the Malawi mom who's toiling every day on her hectare of maize? Does she see the results of these grand global visions and commitments? And I think many of us can agree, no, not really.
And I think there's a separate issue, which is around just human dignity and livelihoods. And that in the course of all this stuff that we're producing, that a lot of people are being left behind. People continue to be very poor, particularly those involved in farming, but not exclusively. There's lots of unequal access to resources and food. So that there's an issue of equality, of social justice in food systems that needs to be addressed. So I think that's in a way why we need this sort of system.
Maybe it's a good moment to turn the question to Alejandro, who has worked so much, especially on the ground and with these difficult to measure but such essential changes that we're looking at, health, environment, and
poverty, inequality.
Yeah, health, poverty, and the leaving no one behind of the SDG agenda as central. And they, IIED has a beautiful track record in really going beyond the dichotomy between those two, I find always. So how do you think, Alejandro, that this framework, which is still very like a very high level framework at the moment, how can it impact on the ground? How do you see that actually happen?
Yeah, I think, I mean, one thing we say in the paper is something along the lines of what we can't measure, we can't care about. And so there is something about putting into the things we care about into a framework. It demonstrates interest, concern, and it's a necessary step to make progress. So I think that's to start with, monitoring and measuring the status of the food system is really important. I'd say that maybe let me just speak out a couple of very quickly of ways in which I think these two things are connected, and also challenges in developing the framework. So one is, and sorry, this is kind of maybe like it doesn't sell newspapers, but there is quite a bit of the food system that actually is working more or less well. So there is this big crisis narrative. It's all, it's all terrible, and everything needs to be changed, and we need to go in and change stuff. And that is true to some extent, but there's quite a bit that's working in the background that is feeding people more or less affordably and delivering more or less nutritious food. And that is, I think, something that this COVID pandemic has shown to a great extent. We're all freaking out where there was going to be food, and actually, farmers continue to produce food at great personal risk, I have to say, many of them. But there is something about the system that means that it's working. So I don't think we need to I don't think we need a blank slate and we need to change everything. We need to be a little bit more surgical in terms of identifying what really doesn't work. So I'll kind of preface that by saying that. And maybe the second, so this monitoring framework, we speak in very broad brush strokes, but I think we do need to start refining this and really figuring out where are those points where change will really matter. So I think that's one key thing to figure out. The other is just that this, I think right now we're at a level of the discussion that is quite global and about kind of global aggregates. So there is a crisis in the climate in the world, right? So there is a global heating crisis, and we need to do something about it. That doesn't mean, and we know that the agriculture and food system is a big contributor to that. That doesn't mean that everywhere it's contributing in the same way. And so it doesn't mean that you can, I've done a little bit of work in Uganda, a little bit of work in Zambia, and actually the emissions, the carbon emissions of the agricultural sector in these countries is quite low actually compared to many other countries. So we can't put in the same bag some parts of rural Zambia with, say, some parts of the Midwest in the United States that is like cranking out soy or cranking out maize with huge environmental impact. So I think it's really important for this framework to be able to distinguish those things. And when we think of progress, that we're not putting the burden of, say, reducing carbon emissions on people who actually, if anything, should probably be increasing their carbon emissions, right? So that's one thing. And the last one I'd say is also related to this issue of diets and health and how we think of this. So there's a big consensus, I think, particularly in the like richer parts of the world, that really we don't need to eat like steak every day, right? It's not good for you, and it's also the ways in which beef is produced is not particularly good for the environment. And I think that's true for some parts of the world, but again, if you go to some of the parts of rural Uganda where I've worked, people eat meat once a year, and they have huge deficits in protein intake. So if anything, they should try to eat a little bit more of meat. So again, putting this burden of the planetary health on the shoulders of the wrong people, I think we need to be very careful about that. So I do think that the framework can be very powerful, but these caveats that I made in terms of the specificity of the types of changes we want to see, and also where we locate that transformation and how we can go beyond these global averages, I think is really, really important.
Jess, do you want to react to that? Because that's indeed the difficulty of creating indicators that want to make something comparable between countries, while in essence the situations, the problems and the solutions are so context specific.
Yeah, I mean it's not. It goes beyond just data. It's also just policies. How you roll out a food policy. It's all about context, right? It's going to look very differently, and that's what makes food systems so interesting, but also so complex. Is that everything is so context dependent, because food environments and politics look very different in different places, from a city to a regional to a national to a supranational level. The problem we have with the data is that not only do we there's a lot of food data out there, but is it of high quality where it meets certain standards? Not a lot of noisy data is one issue, but it also, what Alejandro is getting at, is this disaggregated data where you can parse out indicators by disability, by caste, tribe, gender, urban rural is a very kind of crude disaggregation. We know there's many people living in the in-between spaces, those peri-urban sprawls. So that is really challenging when you start to go below that national aggregated type data, where you can really try to start understanding food systems and how different people are affected by certain aspects of food systems. So we have a lot of challenges, but every day I'm seeing new indicators come out on different measures of food systems, whether it's diets or food environments or climate data. So there's a huge space here in the amount of data, and I think, Alejandro can talk about other ways of thinking about evidence and data beyond just indicators, hard metrics, quantitative metrics. There's lots of other ways to accumulate evidence and data that all informs policymakers about potential ways that they can invest in their food systems and what's worked and what hasn't worked and what are some of the trade-offs. We're accumulating a lot of evidence and data around that. And I think that's a positive thing to add on to Alejandro's positive things. We know a lot more than we have in the past. And so the excuse of we don't know enough, so we can't do anything about it, it's really not true. We do have a lot of evidence that has accumulated over decades and decades, whether it's quantitative evidence or more qualitative experiential evidence.
In the end, if it's about the importance of disaggregated data, of really matching the specificity of problems and solutions with the specificity of data that you would need to inform policy, it's an enormously costly affair as well. And we know from the SDG accountability frameworks that it's very difficult for an FAO, for example, to agree, and then to have, in the end, it's going to be countries that pay for it often. Do you already see some new innovative solutions to overcome this? And both of you, maybe.
Alejandro, do you want me to go?
No, I was thinking about it because we ran into this issue of data. So once you start getting into the indicators proper, or particularly for this framework, you start seeing two things. One is, as Jessica mentioned, the disaggregation. So we don't have a lot of disaggregation. We think of the food system as a relatively closed thing, but actually it's related to everything else. So we'd love to know if the income of people working in the food sector is higher or lower than those working in other sectors. And that actually is very, very hard to come by. Some countries have very, very small samples talking about these types of things, but it's very rare. Let alone, so this is a particularly specific one, but even bigger categories, as Jessica said, gender or ethnicity, they're not widely available. And I think the other one has to do with just coverage. And so there's countries where either they have nothing on any of these, or whether it's particularly unreliable, because we know that they haven't done a good job of putting the data together for a number of these different challenges, including wars and things like that. So I can speak to the challenge it has been when you have an idea about what you like to monitor, which is fantastic. Oh, if only we could do this. But then when you start looking at what's actually available, then you see that there's not much, and that whatever variable you're interested in is not there for like 50 countries, and probably 50 countries where it's more dire and more needed to know those things. So definitely the lack of information, which I think is related to funding, but probably there's other political things going on. It's a big obstacle to achieving this vision, I think, that Jess referred to of the highest quality data possible. And I'm not sure what is the way around that, actually.
Yeah. And I think there's a lot of data that we just can't tap into, but that's already available. So there's the question of who's funding these kind of things, Paulina. That's one issue, because if there are donors out there funding big data initiatives, I haven't yet to meet them, but I'm very keen to meet them. But there's a lot of,
if you're listening now,
if there's a lot of data. There is a lot of data out there. Imagine how much data Google has at their fingertips. Google Map. like how much data that collects on supermarkets and where they are compared to where people live. You know, all the amount of data that Google has, or the amount of data that Amazon has on food purchasing behaviors. So there's a ton of data that's not accessible, or you know, the food world just doesn't utilize it enough. If you think about the amount of private sector data on consumer behavior, they know, they've done lots of studies on focus groups trying to understand what drives demand. They have all of that, and it's just proprietary behind paywalls, things like that. And then there's the area that I still feel in the food world we probably haven't utilized enough, but probably other sectors have. Maybe agriculture has a bit more, is just real-time data, crowdsourcing data. I still feel when you look at food systems, we're still in the past a bit. We haven't really tapped into this whole big data space, and utilizing that effectively for public good are kind of big questions. And I mean, at least not in the worlds probably that Alejandro, myself, and you, Paulina, work in. I'm sure there's whole conferences on big data around food, but we're just not invited to them. Yeah. I don't think the UN is either, right? But there's a ton of data being collected that we just don't see, I think. Yeah. I don't know how you both feel about that.
No, supermarkets know everything about you.
Yeah.
They know everything.
On your I mean, think of the amount of data around food, just food alone, people taking pictures of food and putting it on Instagram, and your purchasing behaviors and what you search for, and yeah, it's incredible. And it's everywhere. I mean, it's not just high-income countries. They're tracking data all over the world.
Yeah. So this data is there, or some of these data is there. It's just not at the hands of decision makers in governments. It's at the hands of decision makers sometimes in companies.